Hi everyone. Today we are going to move into central Mexico and talk about the indigenous drinks there and most notably pulque and some associated people such as the Aztecs. And I'd like to begin by reminding you that the Aztecs were actually the last people to arrive in the area of central Mexico. They arrived only a couple of centuries before the Spanish did, strangely enough, in the 16th century. Um, and it's primarily the Aztecs we'll be talking about, but I want you to realize that many of the practices we'll be discussing actually date much, much longer before to people such as the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Tlaxcalans, those who occupied Teotihuacan. So there are many earlier civilizations that when the Aztecs arrived, they basically adopted those practices. So it's not like they invented them, they just used them. So, and they're the ones we know most about because they were the ones there when the Europeans arrived. So alcoholic beverages actually extend back to prehistoric times. And there is evidence in archaeological remains, and eventually there's written records of these too. We don't have a whole lot of evidence in the New World, but it is known that the manufacture of drinks like pulque goes back probably 1,000 years at least, if not longer than that. And one primary piece of evidence I'd like us to look at in class, or if you're online, just take a look, is a mural 187 feet long, dating to about 200 AD, although some scholars think it's a little later. It was discovered in the Great Pyramid of Cholula. Okay? When a wall collapsed in 1969, they found this behind it, this big mural that depicts people ceremonially drinking out of cups with these large vats behind them. And there are actually 108 people sitting in pairs wearing what look like sort of turbans and loincloths and things. And it is shown a kind of white liquid that they are drinking, and it appears, at least from our perspective, who knows what's actually happening, but it appears that many of the people are drunk, okay, because they're sort of getting loose, whatever. So these archaeologists have called this the bebedores, or drinkers, and often today, if you want to see an image of this, just look up the pulque drinkers, okay. I also think, by comparison to later images, which are Mixtec or Maya, the images on these vases look similar. So that's how they concluded that it is actually pulque that they're drinking. Now today, I should mention this pyramid. It is actually the largest in the whole world by volume. It's overgrown, and there's plants on the outside, and there's actually a church plunked on top of the whole thing. So the mural is inside of this whole thing. But if you want to get a look at sort of what it might have been like in the original day, take a look at Teotihuacan. That's outside of Mexico City, and it is an enormous complex of pyramids. A big pyramid of the sun in the center, and off to the left the moon, and then there's dozens of other little pyramids along there. I went when I was a young kid, and it was just astonishing. So it's also often surmised that pulque drinking is actually much older than this, because in fact, to make pulque, it takes almost no technology whatsoever. And in fact, you can, it's made in the plant itself, strangely enough. If the right bacteria invade, then you don't even need a vessel to make pulque, strangely enough. So let's talk about pulque. What am I talking about here? To start with, we have the plant, which is the agave, okay? And there are several different species that can be used for this. The agave, or maguey as it's sometimes called, it's sometimes also called the century plant. I think under the assumption that it blossoms once in a century or something like that. But in any case, it's a huge spiky leafed plant that grows directly from the ground, that has these big, thick, fleshy leaves, and they come to a point. So you imagine these long, we'll take a look at pictures of it. It sort of looks like an aloe, but they're not related actually. And they're not cacti either, which some people think they're in that family. So when the Spanish arrived, there are many accounts. Let me just give you one to see sort of the description of and wonderment that the Europeans had. This is from Juan de Acosta in the Natural History of the Indies. He said that the maguey is a wonderful tree about which the new settlers write miraculous things, that it gives water and wine, oil, vinegar, honey, syrup, needles and threads, and 100 other things. So you can see that they're kind of amazed. And all those, that list is true, actually. It is a tree much esteemed by the Indians of New Spain. They often have one or several of these trees near their dwelling to help them in daily life as they grow, and they are cultivated in fields. They have a broad, coarse leaf ending in a sharp, strong point, which can be taken and used like a pin, and that is the needle. And a certain kind of fiber or thread is taken from the leaf. Remember, these fibers can be pulled out of it. The trunk, which is thick, can be cut when it is immature, and a large hollow left, whence the sap arises from the root. And it is a liquid that can be drunk like water. It's sweet and cool, and the same liquid, when boiled, becomes a sort of wine. If left to sour, it becomes vinegar, and if reduced by fire, it resembles honey. So this is the sap of the maguey plant, that if you just take off the leaves and leave this cup in the middle, the liquid rises up and will ferment, and if left to sour, will become a kind of vinegar. So he's actually wrong about the boiling point. You actually don't need to boil this to make wine. It is just fermented, and here's how it's done. Supposedly the agave sends up a stalk and flowers every century and then dies, and that's where that name, the century plant, comes from. So to harvest the sap, or what's called agua miel, which sort of means honey water, right? After 12 years, the stalks, or quiotes, are about to grow. The center part is cut off. So this is actually a very interesting term they use for this. It's capazon, which means castration. So you cut off the stalk. Okay, you get it. And after several months, the center is punctured and scraped out, and then the sap begins to collect in the base of the plant. And it has to be collected 2 or 3 times a day with this long ladle that's sort of cylindrical, like a long cylinder, imagine, with a handle on it, after which the leaves are folded over so no dust and insects go in there. And about every day you can pull 6 liters of water out of that plant, which is pretty impressive. And it keeps producing for about 4 to 6 months, and sometimes up to a year. So you can get like a few hundred liters out of every plant. Now, mind you, the plants are huge. The roots go way, way, way down. So what essentially is happening is the roots keep producing this sap even after the top is taken out. And the sap is collected with a gourd. Traditionally, I mean, I guess today they could use a big metal scoop. It's then brought to a house that is filled with vats. The place where the vats are kept is in a special house. In the Nahuatl language, it's tinacali, or tinacal in modern day Spanish, and that's where the stuff is fermented. Okay, it can happen in the plant, but you take it to the special room to ferment it, and you start it with a little bit of the previous batch, so it's already got the bacterial inoculation in it, and then you add it to the new batch. And this is a weird kind of agent. Again, I want you to remember these terms because there are different kinds of fermentation. This is Zymomomus mobilis. Isn't that lovely? Zymomomas. Mobilis. Exactly as it sounds. That's the fermentation agent. It's not yeast. Okay. It takes about a week or more, and then you have this thick, white, viscous, slightly slimy, sour liquid that has about the same alcohol strength as beer. So think about 5% or so. Said to be curiously refreshing, and this is called octli in the Nahuatl language. So, and it's called pulque today. So pulque was a very highly controlled ceremonial drink among the Aztecs, not something you would drink every day. And of course, remember, much of what we know comes from the Spanish who are observing them, not from original indigenous sources. So sometimes they're projecting their own understanding of what's happening on the situation, or sometimes they're misinformed, right? You know, they say, what's going on here, and they don't get it right. But in general, I think we can get a basic impression of how this stuff was used. And again, our primary informant here is let's just call him the first real ethnographer. His name is Bernardino de Sahagún. Sahagún, spelled exactly as it sounds. And he said when a great event was solemnized, and in this case it was a baptism of an infant within the merchant class. I'm not sure what a baptism means unless they're Christian, but I guess they are. He says there would be a feast, people would smoke tobacco, and there would be sweet-smelling flowers festooned around the hall. Various foods were served in clay dishes, along with tortillas. And remember, he's using that Spanish word. A tortilla means a flat cake in Spanish. In Spain, in the New World, it just means a corn tortilla, right? Something very different. In any case, the elder men and women, he says, were then allowed to drink freely of istactli, which means the white pulque. A very large vessel was placed before the guests, and they were served in rank order, from the highest to the lowest. Think about this. Where else have we seen that happen? And the idea was that first you're supposed to get tipsy, and then everyone takes turns singing, and the whole banquet ends with people basically tipsy and telling jokes and being silly. So let me read to you Sahagun's account of this. Very interesting ethnography, I think. So the old men and women gathered again that night to drink pulque, and they got drunk. In order to produce this drunkenness, they placed before them a large pitcher or jar of pulque, and the one who served it poured it into a jicara, which is a calabash gourd, and gave each one according to his rank until there was none left. Sometimes they served a kind of pulque called itzakukli, which means white pulque, which is made of the sap of the maguey. And when the servant found that his charges, the old men and women, did not become intoxicated, he began to serve them again, and this time from the left or opposite side, beginning with those in lowest in rank. And then you go the other direction. Once they were all intoxicated, they began to sing. Some sang, some and cried, others sang to give pleasure. So it's, they're just getting really drunk and singing the whole time. So now the question is, why old people? Why was it the old people who are allowed to drink as much as they want? Some people said, well, this is because the old people over 50, their blood begins to run cold, and pulque was categorized as a warm drink, so they drink this and it's good for them and it's warm. And I think really that's a post-colonial rationale. That doesn't really fit in well with the logic of the Aztec medical system. It sounds actually like humoral medicine, right? It's that whole allopathic system that the Spanish inherited from ancient Greece, brought with them to Mexico, and kind of imposed upon the local people like they did Christianity, right? Now, the more logical explanation to me seems that most people have to be alert to do their duties, to actually do their job or behave in a way that's appropriate for them. But old people, I think, have already fulfilled their duties to their families, their responsibility to the community. So it seems like there's actually a social rationale for this exemption on drinking, and that once you've reached age 50, you can drink all you want. I like that rule. That's perfectly fine. And young people only get to drink, presumably at a few religious festivals, and in fact at weddings. It's called a time when children are given pulque. So clearly it's not forbidden outright to them, but it's under very controlled situations, and only these special celebrations when they don't have responsibilities, right? When they're not supposed to. Now, what's interesting is, although there are records of people getting drunk, there seem to have been very severe rules against it, or at least they frowned upon it. It was a sign of great disgrace to be drunk. Let me read you a little, and laws too. A little bit here is the drunkard, if he was a plebeian, had his hair cut publicly in the market square. His house was sacked and torn down, because the law said that he who deprived himself of good judgment was not worthy to have a house, but could live in the fields like an animal. And the second time he was punished with death, and if he was a noble, the first time he was caught committing this crime, he was punished with death. So presumably it seems it's like a greater disgrace if you're a nobleman, because you're supposed to be setting an example for other people. So if you're found drunk, you don't get a second chance. If you're a noble, you get executed right away. And for women, very interestingly, the rules are even more strict. There's a story that I think illustrates this point. A king, Nezahualcoyotl, takes refuge in a noble woman's house. This is Tzilotl Tomiao. Okay, I think I've said it right, who knows? And he discovers that she has this whole extensive field of agave plants, and that she has actually surreptitiously been making the pulque for her household and even selling it to other people. And this is all, of course, against the law. So the king wonders, this is all against the law, so he kills her, slays her, and declared that pulque is the most pernicious thing. It destroys commoners because everyone drinks it in excess. And there's also, in fact, an image of the in the Codex Mendoza. This is an original Aztec text from 1541 that shows that people, for being drunk, get stoned to death. And in the caption above it, the little figures actually read, "This is what they deserved." Okay, so there's an idea that it is such a disgrace that death is an appropriate punishment for being drunk. So clearly, what this suggests to me is that, you don't have such extraordinarily severe punishments like this unless A, they're really, really worried about it, and B, if people are doing it anyway, right? Because clearly, if it were not a problem, they wouldn't have to make such laws, and if it weren't a recurring thing, they wouldn't have to have the laws so ridiculously stringent, right? And I think people did, of course, find ways to drink it, and there are myths, that try to dissuade people from doing so. That's what myths do. They explain the status quo, but they also try to uphold it by influencing behavior. So, when someone communicates a myth to you, it's got a directive for your action. So there's a story that is an encounter between Quetzalcoatl, as a bird god, and the war god Tezcatlipoca. And this is a very good example of this. The latter makes a big meal for the former, I guess, and it includes pulque. And Quetzalcoatl, who's the guest, says, "I'm not touching that." And then finally, the war god says, "Well, just taste a little drop of this. It's not going to hurt you." And he takes a sip. And then he nudges him a little more, and then he takes a cup, and he gives him a little more. He wants to be hospitable, right? So he finally drinks a lot of it. He gets completely drunk, and for this, Quetzalcoatl, of course, has now set a really bad example for people. He's exiled, and he's sent to the Eastern Sea and beyond it. And it's also why, strangely, when Cortez showed up with his big red beard, people thought, this is Quetzalcoatl returning. This is the initiation of a new era in human history because he's come back. But when you hear the story, you never get the original reason he was exiled, is that it's for drunkenness. So without that myth, they might have understood Cortez's arrival very differently, and he might not have actually prevailed over the Aztec Empire. It has to do with drink. I know, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? So there are also origins, stories, myths about the origin of pulque. And when I say myth, I don't mean that it's untrue. It obviously is very true. It informs people's actions. It's just it's a story that's told to explain things. And so here's another story about the origin of pulque. So there's a goddess, Mayahuel. She is the personification of maguey, okay, of the plant itself. She's also the goddess of fertility and of nourishment. So she's something like Ceres in ancient Roman times, where we get the word cereal, of course, right? So the agua miele, or sap, that collects in the plant is her blood. Okay, and there are also, I should mention, ritual bleeding ceremonies in which the priest, or the emperor actually at some point, is pricked with the thorn of the maguey in his genitals, and he's supposed to bleed on the earth. And this is to ensure fertility. I know everyone, males then cringe, having a big needle put in you. And Mayahuel also, incidentally, has hundreds of breasts with which she feeds her offspring. Again, very much like Ceres, oddly enough. So her offspring are the 400 moon rabbits, okay? This is Tsenson Totochtin, who are, and the moon rabbits are the ones who are responsible for drunkenness. They're the little gods of drunkenness, or the moon rabbits. So when you drink, it is said that your spirit is possessed by the moon rabbits. And there are different ones that will, depending on which one possesses you, you may become quarrelsome, you may become sleepy, you may get very happy and want to sing, whatever. So it depends on which moon rabbit possesses you. And in fact, there are people who are born on a specific day, two rabbit day, which means you're predisposed to getting drunk whenever you look at pulque. So, and in fact, the word to get drunk in Nahuatl is to rabbit yourself. Okay, so the next time someone asks what you did last night, you said, I rabbited myself. So, and the interesting thing that I mentioned about this, also the danger of drunkenness, is that there are certain times, certain conditions or states in which a person's soul or his tonali will leave the body. This is while you're asleep, your soul can travel to other places, which is why you have dreams, these weird adventures. When you are having sex, actually, you lose your sensory perception. Your tonali temporarily goes out of your body, and hopefully it comes back. Otherwise, you die. Um, and um, and when you're drunk, your tonali leaves. So it's kind of a medically dangerous time period for people. There's another myth, and these are all very interesting. I think that the possum Tlacuache was scraping the center of the agave. Okay, he's the like you do to make the sap run up, and he discovered pulque, and he decides to drink it. Says, this looks good. And this possum is the god that makes rivers, and the Aztecs said that, well, rivers would normally run very straight, but in fact, when Tlacuache made the rivers, he was drunk, which is why they go all over the place. He was wandering back and forth and staggering, and which is why all rivers are crooked. Okay, that is, sort of explains how things are, and of course it gives you a warning, right? As if you're drunk, you're gonna act in a similar way and make irresponsible riverbeds, right? So. Another consideration, and I make this, about most intoxicating substances also, is that pulque is also food. Okay, I don't want you to think this is just some dangerous drug that they use. A liter of pulque, let me give you some real specifics. Has 204 calories, 4.4 grams of protein, 3.9 megagrams of, no, it can't be a megagram, what is it? It's something, milligrams, sorry, of niacin, 62 milligrams of vitamin C. So there's been this sort of argument for a long time whether the Aztecs were protein deficient because they actually don't have domesticated cattle, right? And this, to some people contend, Marvin Harris especially, led them to cannibalism, as they reached a point where they didn't have enough protein to keep themselves alive, so they took tribute in the form of humans from their subject tribes and ate them. Okay. Actually, cannibalism is a religious ritual. It's not something people eat regularly as food, even though there is a very nice recipe for corn and man stew. I think it's called tlaclayoli. Okay. In any case, the argument doesn't really hold water because there are tons of wild animals. There are deer, there are peccaries, which are like little pigs, there's rabbits, there's also spirulina, which is this very nutritious kind of pond muck. It's an algae basically, and it goes into a lot of drinks. Now you can buy it in this, in a health food store. Insects they ate, crickets, and pulque. Pulque, like beer, provides a good supplement of protein and a lot of essential nutrients. So in places where there's scant water, like agave grows in fairly high altitudes, it's also a very good source of clean water, right? This is the plant kind of filters it for you and takes out the impurities. It's also been suggested that in high altitudes, vegetables don't grow very well, so that the pulque may actually have been essential in the diet. And consumed in fairly large quantities. Their guess is about 2 liters a day, which is, that's 2 big water bottles full of this stuff a day, which is almost exactly the same as European beer consumption at the same time. So I'm just suggesting that pulque may serve a very similar function as beer does in Europe. There's also a suggestion been made that the Aztecs considered pulque medicinal. A Spaniard conquistador, Motolinia, says that after complaining about drunkenness, that in reality, drunk in moderation, it is healthy and strengthening, and all medicines which he's talking about the Indians, administer orally are given to the patient with this wine in their cup. And there they place whatever is restorative for each illness. So it's the medium for giving people medicine, again, like alcohol back in Europe, right? So the attitude also, it's similar in so many ways to the attitude of Europeans toward wine, and I think let me just veer off for a second and talk about the medical system here, because the indigenous system does actually seem in some ways to be similar to the humoral system we spoke about in Western civilization. What is missing, they do talk about foods being hot and cold. What is missing is the moist and dry axis of that four-part humoral system. There's really only two parts in the Aztec system. And I think what probably happened is when the Spanish arrived, the Greek system was kind of laid on top of the Aztec, much like the churches were built on top of the Aztec temples. And just as Christianity accommodated many earlier practices, they didn't come and say everything you know is banned and now here's Christianity. They sort of said, well, this Day of the Dead that you're practicing, well, that's All Souls Day. It's the same thing that we're talking about. So all the skulls and things you see on All Souls Day, they're not in mainstream Christianity. They're completely indigenous and just accommodated. So I think what happened, and this makes perfect sense, is in colonial times, the pulque was categorized as a cold phlegmatic medicine, and that comes just from the fact that it's milky and it's like milk, and phlegmatic means it's cold, but also because it's sour. The sourness would cause them to categorize it that way. And it appears that even in the indigenous medical system, that you take this special cooling medicine before hard work, not after. I know that seems really strange. We think you work hard, you sweat, and then you drink something refreshing. They thought that would upset the system so drastically that the super heat and the super cold would just throw you off entirely. So you drink it before you start to work, so your body is chilled, and then it warms up moderately. Okay, and the idea is that the pulque is a medicine that cools the tonali, that spirit. Okay, and this is called noche huitztli, to rest, to gather strength for work. That's what they call it. And so you drink before you go to work. I know this sounds kind of strange, of course, according to our capitalist idea of when you drink and when it's appropriate. This is completely inappropriate, but it is. But it's the custom there is to drink before, but not to get drunk. Of course, getting drunk totally weakens your tonali. So this is so it's interesting that it's their interest in health leads to a conclusion that's completely different from the European one. What is also fascinating about pulque is that once the Spanish conquered Mexico, all the former restrictions were abandoned, right? It actually becomes the common drink because the colonial government thought, hey, we can tax this stuff. We need a source of revenue, and if people want to drink pulque, we're going to slap a tax on it. And that happens officially in the 17th century. I think 1650, pulque becomes one of the major sources of revenue for the state. And reports ensued following that this is a healthy drink, it's good for you, and as long as you consume it in moderation. They don't want people to get drunk, of course, but they don't want to alienate that revenue either. Now, what is fascinating is the Spanish themselves, the people who were born in Spain, or even those of Spanish descent who lived in Mexico, they did not want to drink this stuff. They drank wine, and they imported it from Spain. I know that sounds completely crazy, but and in fact, Cortez, when he got to Mexico, thought, oh, we'll just plant grapes here, and it's actually too hot and dry. You can grow grapes in the northern part of Mexico, and certainly Baja grows a lot of grapes and that sort of thing. But what happened was eventually the Spanish king outlaws the growing of grapes, which is why Mexico never had really a wine industry, because the king in Spain wanted them to buy it from them. They had tons of wine, right? And so that trade going back and forth, strangely enough, perversely, was largely in something that they could have been growing fairly close by, but didn't, for trade reasons. But in any case, the result of all of this is that pulque became firmly associated with indigenous people. First as a lowly drink, right? If you drank pulque, it meant you were an Indian, and if you drank wine, it meant you're Spanish. Of course, people started to mix, and that makes the whole thing confusing. But I think that only later, only really when you get to the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, when Mexico, of course, becomes its own nation in the 19th century, drinking pulque became a matter of pride, as people thought, well, this is our indigenous drink, and we're not ashamed of being. Now they said we're now the official policy is of the government was we're all mixed, we're all Spanish and indigenous, which is of course not true entirely. There are lots of other people. There are African peoples on the coast in Veracruz that they don't account for, but at least the official line is that all of Mexicans are mixed in race, but it meant to drink pulque was a matter of pride. Why should we shouldn't buy wine from Spain? They've been exploiting us. It's kind of like the Americans' attitude toward tea from the British Empire. And in fact, the situation really only changes in the latter half of the 19th century, and you probably know what happens there. Industrialization comes, and German immigrants introduce beer. Beer is much cheaper, easier to make in volume, and especially if it's in a factory, you have tons of beer. So beer replaces pulque as the national drink because it's much cheaper. And of course, beer lasts a long time. It doesn't go sour. Pulque becomes sour within a couple of days. So pulque has to be made in a little shop and sold directly to the consumer within a week. And beer drinkers, of course, manufactured this whole rhetoric that pulque is unsanitary, that the fermentation process is started with human feces. I mean, they just scared the shit out of people, literally. That's of course not true, but the pulque is almost completely pushed out of the market by the early 20th century. And so when you think of the common drink of Mexico today, it's just by accident that it's beer. Dos Equis and Tecate and all those, Mexico's a very, very large beer drinking country. And of course, Mexican beer has been very cleverly marketed. So you can find Dos Equis anywhere in the world. And the only places where pulque is still consumed are really mountainous, rural regions, mostly among peoples who are still natives, or I should say indigenous. And you can still find pulquerias in Mexico. There is still production. Apparently, in the state of Hidalgo, it's a common drink. It seems to be kind of a touristy thing to do now. If you go there, you want to drink in the authentic experience of the local culture. And in fact, there's an episode of Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations. Have you ever seen this? Where he's in Mexico, and he says, "I'm getting me some pulque," and and he goes into a little pulqueria and drinks this stuff, and then vomits. He describes it, and I'm quoting here: "It was as delicious and nutritious as Ryan Seacrest's love juice." I thought, like, this guy, he's insane, obviously. In any case, I was sort of curious about pulque, and apparently it is being sold abroad in cans. Nectar del Razo, which is about 5.5%, I think it's sold mostly to immigrants from Mexico who live in the US. But strangely, it's kind of getting this hip, sort of alternative, exotic, ancient association. And strangely, the idea is that it might be better for you than mass-produced beer, because it's got in local fermentation process, and that it's probiotic and all this stuff. So they're also adding flavorings to it. There's coconut pineapple. There's a strawberry pulque. And what is weirder, is that because it's a naturally produced product, people are claiming it has health benefits. Kind of the way kombucha, became very hip, and then I think it's disappearing. I don't know. I rather like it, but but in any case, this is true. What happens in the fermentation is the pH falls from 7.4 down to 3.5 or so, which means it gets acidic. The sucrose content falls from 15% to 1%. Of course, it's all changed to alcohol, and then the vitamin levels are actually increased. You get more vitamins are available to be absorbed by your body. So the vitamin content increases, for example, from 5 to 29 milligrams per 100 gram for thiamine. from 54 to 515 for niacin, and 18 to 33 milligrams for riboflavin. So this actually is nutritious. There's no doubt about that. And like a lot of products, the nutritional value is increased by fermentation. It's true of soy. It's true of all sorts of things we ferment. So let me mention just a couple of other indigenous New World drinks, though interestingly, there really aren't any that anyone knows about in North America. I mean, in other words, I don't mean North America, I mean what's today the United States and Canada. The extreme Southwest, of course, is still part of the Mexican culture, but and in fact, there's some things there, like a wine that's made from prickly pear cactus fruit, or what's in Spanish called tuna. Okay, not like a fish, but tuna is a little fruit on there. And this stuff is called calonche. The fruits are peeled, they're squeezed, they boil the juice down, and then you add a starter from the previous batch and ferment it. So it's kind of a wine. It's a fruit wine, if you want to think of it that way. Tepache is another drink, at first made from corn, although nowadays it seems to be made just as often from pineapples or oranges, and sometimes they add sugar in it to get the alcohol level a little higher. There's also a kind of beer made of maize, and there's of course no reason you can't make beer make it out of any grain. This is called tesguino, which you start by chewing on the corn kernels. The spit in your saliva, of course, breaks down protein and turns it into sugar, right? You all know that. So you spit into this, and then the corn kernels are boiled down into a syrup, and that's fermented. And so this is apparently still made by the Tarahumara Indians. Tesguinadas are a huge party where you throw this big party and consume large amounts of this. So a lot of the corn crop actually goes into making this sort of beer. In fact, there's a very similar drink in South America called chicha, which is also made of corn, but also sometimes cassavas and other fruits. And there is also a chicha de jora, which is found in the Andes. Jora is yellow maize. So just there's sort of there's other stuff apart from the agave, and like the others, you chew the grains, you grind them, or you you moisten them in your mouth basically, and you spit them out. And what's happening is the ptyalin in your spit converts the starches into sugar. And more recently, the people have started sprouting and malting the grains of corn just like you would beer. And you probably know that there are efforts to make gluten-free beers, because most beer has gluten in it. And so they're experimenting with corn. I think sorghum is probably the one that they're most successful with. But this probably has some potential, a corn beer, which is sort of the ancestor of, bourbon, if you want to think of it that way. So in any case, the Inca would drink this, and before you take a sip, you pour some on the ground to Mother Earth. And to this day, people do it. You say this, Pachamama Santa Tierra. So that's so the first half is Quechua, Mother Earth is Pachamama, and then the second half is Spanish, means holy ground. So in any case, I mention this because our friends at the Dogfish Head Brewery made some in 2010. They're the ones who made the Midas Touch and other ancient drinks. So they claim to have started the corn with saliva and then dried it into cakes and added strawberries and stuff. I don't know who wants to taste that, not me. In any case, so let's think of the timing of the encounter of Western culture with pulque. So the moment these conquistadors arrive in Mexico, what is the hot new item sweeping through Europe? Of course, it's the new technology. It's distilled wine, right? I mean, alcohol high, hooch. And of course, it wouldn't be so long before they figured that this stuff that is vile swill that the local population are drinking, maybe you can purify it through a still, because they don't have grapes to play with also, and make a palatable drink out of it. Of course, what we're talking about here is mezcal and tequila, of course. So before I, assume that it is of course the Spanish who introduced distillation to Mexico, there is an interesting article that came out just a couple of years ago which suggests that distillation technology actually came from China. Um, and this sounds really far-fetched, but it actually isn't so much, because at the end of uh, the third quarter of the 16th century, the Spanish had made it from the west coast of Mexico all the way to across the Pacific to the Philippines, named for the king, right, Philip II of Spain. Manila is founded in the 1570s, I guess, and that connects them to the trade routes that go to China. Philippines were basically a stopping off point for the Asian trade to pick up China dishes and silk and spices and things like that. This whole trade route of the Manila galleons connects Mexico to China. I know that may sound surprising to you. Um, so it is not inconceivable that the techniques that the Chinese were using to distill their own soy-based products, sochu and things like that, would have gone through the Philippines, and in fact in the Philippines they were already distilling coconut, so they would have known it there also, coconut, fermented coconut milk. And there's an idea that the Spanish get their distilling technology in Mexico from the Chinese first. Now, it's hard to prove, but there's archaeological evidence that the kind of stills they were using are very different from the alembic. So who knows? Whatever the origin, the Spanish did also introduce the copper alembic still. And there are many interesting factors about why they would have turned their attention to agave. I think it has mostly to do again with this ban on vineyards in New Spain. This is Philip II again, 1595. He says there is to be no wine growing in Mexico. And he wanted the colonists to import wine and, of course, brandy that they're making also. And he could tax that, right? He thought, if it's all the way on the other side of the world, there's no way I'm going to get this tax revenue. So I think this kind of pushed the colonists to experiment with indigenous plants. And there is one person, Don Pedro Sanchez de Tagle, who's the Marquis of Altamira, Caballero de la Orden de Calatrava. That's a military order, one of the three great military orders in Spain. He's considered the father of tequila, Don Pedro. Okay, that's all you need to remember. And apparently he set up a factory in about 1600. It appears in the tax records very quickly. By 1621, he was processing agave on an industrial scale with a plantation, large-scale distillation, and a report of a guy who visits, this is Domingo Lázaro de Arequi, states that the hearts of the roasted mezcal, which are crushed by a stone wheel to extract the mosto for fermentation, is the alquitara, creating a liquid as clear as water but as strong as aguardiente. Aguardiente is the Spanish word for burning water, for aquafortis, right? They start taxing it, of course, the local officials. So so I think that's the birth of tequila as we know it. The mezcal, or mezcal with a Z is how it's often spelled in Mexico, is actually a much larger category. It can be made from a whole variety of different agave species. And I want you to put out of your mind any association of mezcal with the junk that has the worm in the bottom. That's actually a marketing gimmick invented in the early 20th century. There's nothing, although that little worm, the gusano, does grow in the plant, and they do actually eat it there. But putting it in the bottle and selling it that way is just nonsense. So the word mezcal itself is a Nahuatl word. Mexcali is what the original word would have been, and that just means cooked maguey. So it's the pine, what's called the piñon, the center of this whole plant, is roasted, and that gives you this word mexcali. And mezcal, I should say, is enjoying a kind of revival. I just want you to think this is not necessarily an inferior product. And in fact, the only reason that we don't pay much attention to it is tequila has done a wonderful job at self-promotion and advertising and brilliant marketing and selling abroad. And mezcal is its a poorer neighbor, but not necessarily an inferior product at all. So tequila is a subcategory of mezcal. It has to be grown in a specific region, mostly in the state of Jalisco and near the city of Guadalajara, but you can also find it in other states and in the mountains, but it's that general area. And supposedly that altitude and soil quality and everything gives the liquor a more floral and aromatic character. In all cases, it must be made only with the native blue agave plant, so you can't just use any old agave in this. And it's been speculated that the first tequilas really are just pulque distilled, which is not far from it. It's a little different process, right? The cooking of the pine. Today, tequila is made from the entire plant. The outer leaves are cut off with this big curved knife by a guy called a jimadore. Jimadores cut that off. When it's very ripe, so you have this big oval kind of pine cone shaped thing that called a pina, in fact, that weighs about 200, 250 pounds. This is a big, heavy thing, and that's the core of the plant. And so, or it's kind of like a pineapple, sort of shape, with the leaves cut off. So, traditionally, the way this is processed is you'd cook it in an earth oven, so a palenque. Take a big pit. You put 8 feet deep. You put the stones at the bottom of the whole thing. You make a fire in there and burn it. And of course, the rocks get really hot. And then the piñas are put inside of it. You cover it with wet fiber. It's left over actually from pressing them the last time, so it's made of the same plant. And then you cover it with palm leaves, and it cooks. And you just leave it there for days. The slow heat kind of steams the pines. You get this lovely smoky aroma. And the starches in the pines begin to transform to sugars. Okay? This is what happens in cooking also. The whole process, obviously it's very labor intensive, but once you've buried it, you just leave it there for a few days. Today, of course, they don't do it that way. They put it in an oven, they bake it slowly, but of course the Maillard reaction is what caramelization happens. Like if you take an apple and you slowly brown it, the sugars just become this wonderful aromatic complex of flavors. So in any case, then they take these cooked cores, they crush them in a stone circular mill to get the juice out of them. This is called a tahona. And then the juice, well, actually they call it mosto, which is very interesting. It's the same thing as freshly crushed wine, grape juice. They then ferment that, and then they put it into a still. Usually they ferment it 2 or 3 times, so it's pretty clear, and all the impurities are removed. And remarkably, that whole process hasn't actually changed much in the past few hundred years. Especially the growing side of the process is exactly the same, the way they're grown and cut and roasted. The distilling, on the other hand, is totally ramped up. And there is really cheap industrial tequila. You all know it's you can buy it anywhere, any place that sells liquor, it's there. But there is still a lot that's made in the traditional way. And I want to sort of just introduce to you that some of this stuff is, it's very hard to differentiate between them, because there are a lot of companies out there that sell their tequila and claim that they're doing something in a very traditional, artisan, crafty way. And craft tequila is a big business now. But the scale is so large that you wonder, wait, how could anyone's hands actually ever be on this, as long as they're, selling incredible hundreds and millions of gallons of this stuff. I did a paper on this actually, and included an example of a tequila distillery that could give, I think I figured out it was every single man, woman, and child in the United States a shot every day of the year for their output. It was just unbelievable. So tequila, let me give you a little more information. There is a city called Tequila in Jalisco. This is central western Mexico. And there are hundreds and hundreds of brands now, right? I mean, they and of course differ in quality greatly. Some are made of 100% blue agave. We'll say that on the label. Some are distilled with sugar, so that means they're kind of half rum, half tequila mix, which is much, much cheaper. They're also tequila, the most familiar is white tequila, right? Which is kind of bland. You rarely drink it on its own unless I guess you could do shots of it, but usually it's mixed into a drink, something like a margarita, right? And a margarita is nothing like the drink made with the horrible syrupy glop that they have in a pre-made mix in the United States. A margarita is just lime juice, tequila, a little orange liqueur like triple sec, or if you're really extravagant, Grand Marnier, which is weird because that's brandy based. But anyway, the rim can be salted, or if not, you all know how to do that. You just run a lime around the rim of a glass, turn it upside down into a plate of salt, and you have a salted rim. And it's, if it's hot out, it's kind of lovely. Um, the drink is not sweet, and it is not frozen. Okay, it's not like a slushy. And in Mexico, actually, the one you see just as often is called a paloma, which is tequila and grapefruit soda. It's jarritos. You can find that up here. Um, and sometimes a wedge of lime, or it's drunk with a shot of sangrita, which is orange juice and pomegranate with chili peppers, which is kind of interesting. Or you can make it with leftover juice from a fruit salad. You'll pour in that, and there's a lot of different ways that it's mixed into drinks that we really don't experiment much with in this country. And if you have a third glass of lime juice, then you have a kind of Mexican flag, right? You have the red, white, and green, and you sip from each in turn, which is, but of course you mix only cheap tequila. You don't do that with the expensive stuff. And I wish I could figure it out, but I cannot. Where this whole idea of putting salt on your hand and licking it, squeezing a lime and doing a chaser. I have no idea. I assume that's an American thing. I don't know. So in an entirely different class from all of these, there are aged tequilas. There are ones that you sip, and they're closer aesthetically to brandy. You would not mix this stuff into a drink. There are actually legal classifications for these. There is oro, which is gold, which is generally colored with caramel and is kind of cheap. It's just made to resemble tequila, and they do that to a lot of drinks, I should mention. If you buy brown colored rum, it's not really aged, it's caramel coloring. Same with a lot of cheap bourbon. I mean, it's they don't have to put it on the label because it's technically not food, so alcohol can be labeled however. You don't have to label it, you just throw any junk in, and flavorings too, I should mention. So oro doesn't mean much. Reposado actually does. It means reposed. It's sleeping. It's resting. And that means it's spent some time in an oak barrel, which gives it the color and some complex aroma. Vanillin comes in. I mean, a cheaper one, they can actually add artificial vanilla flavoring, but vanilla that comes from the wood is far more subtle and with depth, and other compounds also. And then there is añejo, which means aged. That's usually a couple of years. And then lastly, a more recent categorization is called Maduro, which means that it has to be aged at least 3 years. And I've even seen stuff that says extra Maduro, which means super aged. So it is and it's, of course, now there are premium tequilas. I would encourage you to just look that up and look at some of these brands, because tequila is actually, there's expensive stuff, and it's not all cheap. Now, what I find fascinating, and I'm just going to have you think about this because it always strikes me as really weird, is if you go into a liquor store like Bevmo here in Stockton, they have some cases locked up, okay? And I can sort of understand, okay, you have the really expensive absinthe is locked up, for example. Those, they cost $80, $100 a bottle sometimes, so you don't want people walking off with them. So someone has to come and help you and take these out of the case and bring it to the register, and you don't touch it until you've paid for it, basically. I sort of get that, and I think some of the more expensive brandies are in there. If you buy a bottle of Remy Martin, it's $150 now or something like that. So, okay. But the tequila is all locked up. Unless it's a really cheap brand, Jose Cuervo isn't, but the majority of the tequilas are also in a locked case. And that is not the case with the expensive scotch, with the expensive rum. The bourbon is by and large out also, even the really expensive stuff. So I want you to ponder this a moment, because it sounds kind of racist to me, honestly. Their expectation is that some of the bottles are going to walk off, and it's tequila. Why? That's really a strange and interesting phenomenon to me. I've never really asked them why they do that, but I guess that's their assumption. So let's think about really good tequila, and we will, I've actually got to get to class right now, so I'm going to stop. We'll talk about it in class, of course.